I want to tell you something that took me a long time to say out loud without my voice doing something embarrassing. The morning I collapsed at work, I was not being dramatic. I was not making a scene. I had been sitting in a conference room on the 14th floor of a glass building in Canary Wharf, listening to my director talk about Q3 projections, and my heart, the one I had been quietly managing for 2 years, medicating every morning with a glass of water and a prayer that nobody would ever notice, simply decided it had had enough. Not of the meeting, of everything. I slid out of my chair without a sound, the way something heavy tips when it's been balanced wrong for too long. And before anyone had even thought to dial 999, before the paramedics had been called, before anyone had checked whether I was breathing, Richard Hale looked at the room full of people staring at my body on the floor and said, loud and unbothered, "This is what she does. She wants the attention." I know this because 3 people told me afterward. I know it because one of them wrote it down. And I know it because when I finally opened the folder I had been building for 18 months, it turned out to be exactly the kind of thing that ends a career. Just not mine. I did not grow up believing the world would be easy for me. That is not a complaint. It is just the shape of my particular life. My parents came to London from Accra with very specific instructions they gave themselves. Work harder than anyone expects, speak more carefully than anyone requires, and never, under any circumstances, give anyone a reason to look at you and feel confirmed in something they already believed. I absorbed those instructions the way children absorb everything, not by being told, but by watching. By noticing who got the benefit of the doubt in rooms and who had to earn it from scratch every single time. By the time I was in secondary school, I had already understood, without anyone ever saying it plainly, that I would need to be demonstrably better to be considered approximately equal. So I became demonstrably better. I studied harder. I worked longer. I checked my own work twice before showing it to anyone. I built competence the way other people build walls, carefully, brick by brick, because I needed it to hold. By the time I was 33 and walking into Caldwell and Voss Financial Consulting for my first day as a senior analyst, I had spent 15 years becoming someone who could not easily be dismissed. I had a first-class degree from Exeter, a postgraduate qualification in financial risk, and a track record that I was genuinely proud of. I had earned every line on my CV. I knew that about myself in the way that you know things that have cost you something. And Richard Hale, at that point, was the person who had found me. That is the part I need you to understand before I explain what came later. Because what happened between us did not start with cruelty. It started with something that felt, at the time, like recognition. He had headhunted me directly. He called my then manager at Morrison Reed, asked for a quiet conversation, and 3 weeks later I was sitting across from him in a Canary Wharf coffee shop while he told me, with what seemed like genuine precision, exactly what he saw when he looked at my work. Not the general shape of it, the specific details. He mentioned a risk modeling framework I had rebuilt from scratch 2 years earlier. He mentioned a client presentation I had delivered that had apparently been discussed outside the walls of Morrison Reed without my knowledge. He said, and I remember this clearly because it landed somewhere tender, "You are one of those people who does the actual thinking while someone else gets the actual credit. I would like to change that for you." I believed him. I want to be honest about that. I was not naive. I knew recruitment conversations were performances of a kind, but I believed him in the way you believe something when it names a wound you have never articulated to anyone. He had looked at my work and seen not just the output but the invisible labor behind it, the uncredited labor, and he was offering to make it visible. I joined Caldwell and Voss in January. By March, Richard had featured my analysis in 2 senior leadership presentations. By June, I had been introduced to 3 of the firm's largest clients by name, as the analyst who had run their risk modeling. He took me to a quarterly review dinner and sat me next to one of the firm's founding partners and said, in front of everyone, "Miriam is the reason our numbers look the way they do." I think about that sentence sometimes, what it gave me, how much I needed to hear it, and how well Richard understood both of those things. The first year was, in retrospect, the investment phase. He was making a deposit. He was teaching me to feel seen, to feel chosen, to feel that my loyalty to him was the logical expression of gratitude for someone who had finally, properly, noticed me. And it worked. I worked 60-hour weeks with something close to enthusiasm. I stayed late without resentment. I took on complexity without complaint. When he asked me to absorb additional work after the first round of layoffs, I did it without asking whether I was being compensated for it, because it felt like trust rather than exploitation. The layoffs happened in my second year. February, a gray and blunt month that suited the occasion. 6 analysts were let go in a single afternoon, called into HR one by one while the rest of us sat at our desks pretending to work and listening for footsteps. The official reason given was business restructuring. The actual reason, which I understood more clearly with time, was that Richard had proposed the cuts in a way that preserved his own budget line, protected his team's visible headcount while quietly eliminating the people whose work he could redistribute to those who remained. He was very skilled at this, at making institutional violence look like administrative tidiness. I was not let go. I was given more work. I want to be precise about what that looked like in practice, because I think it is easy to hear more work and understand it abstractly. What I mean is that by the end of that year, I was running the analytical workload of what had previously been a team of 3. I was producing risk models, client-facing reports, internal strategy documents, and forecast reviews. I was writing the first drafts of presentations that Richard would deliver to senior leadership with a single cover slide that said * prepared by R. Hale, Managing Director. I was answering emails at 11 o'clock at night and setting alarms for 5:30 in the morning so I could be in the office before the cleaning staff finished. I was eating lunch at my desk more often than not, which sounds minor until you understand that it meant I was also rescheduling the medical appointments that I should have been keeping without negotiation. My arrhythmia was not dramatic. That is the right word for it. It was not the kind of heart condition that announces itself loudly or collapses you without warning every other week. It was a structural electrical problem, managed with medication, requiring monitoring, requiring regular follow-up with my cardiologist to ensure the medication was still calibrated correctly. The follow-ups were every 4 months. In my second year at Caldwell and Voss, I attended 1. I rescheduled the others 3 times each before letting them quietly lapse into the administrative graveyard of things I kept meaning to address. My medication I managed on my own, refilling the prescription at whatever pharmacy was convenient and trusting that what had worked last year would work this year, which is exactly the kind of reasoning that sounds sensible under pressure, and is, clinically speaking, not sensible at all. I knew this. I want to be clear about that too. I am not a person who is unaware of what she was doing to herself. I knew I was running a risk. I told myself it was temporary, that the pace would ease, that once the current quarter closed I would make the appointments, attend them, catch up on everything I had let slide. I told myself this the way you tell yourself a lot of things when you are in survival mode. Not because you believe them, but because you need them to be true long enough to get through the week. Richard never asked about my health. I would not have expected him to, particularly. But there is a difference between not asking and actively making it harder. He scheduled calls for first thing in the morning and last thing in the evening, with the casual confidence of someone who has never had to plan around anything external to the job. He distributed urgent deadlines on Friday afternoons. He sent messages on public holidays with the subject line "not urgent," but when you get a chance followed by 3 pages of notes that were, evidently, urgent. He created an environment in which there was no natural break, no rhythm of recovery, and then he decorated that environment with the language of wellness. The newsletter about sleep hygiene, the email reminder about the firm's mental health support line, the all-staff message he sent during Mental Health Awareness Week that said * at Caldwell and Voss. We believe that our people are our most important asset. I saved that email, not for any particular reason at the time, just because something about it made my jaw tighten in a way I didn't entirely understand, and I had gotten into the habit, somewhere in my second year, of saving things that made my jaw tighten. The folder started as a professional reflex more than a deliberate strategy. I am, by nature and training, a person who documents things. I create audit trails. I keep records not because I distrust the people I work with, but because I have spent enough time in financial services to understand that memory is not a reliable instrument, and that the only protection against the revision of history is contemporaneous evidence. So I had a folder. A private one, on an encrypted personal drive I kept at home, into which I dropped things with the same routine neutrality I applied to most of my administrative habits. An email here, a screenshot there, a note I had typed into my phone after a meeting because something Richard said felt important to preserve precisely. I was not building a case. I was just keeping records. That distinction matters for how I feel about myself now, and I want to name it clearly. By the time I collapsed, the folder was 18 months old and contained more than 300 items. The Thursday morning it happened, I had been at my desk since 7. I had not eaten anything. I had taken my medication the night before but had skipped the morning dose because I had run out 2 days earlier and had not yet managed to call the pharmacy, a thing I had been meaning to do for 48 hours and kept being pulled away from. The all-hands meeting was at 9. I walked into conference room B on the 14th floor, took my usual seat near the back of the long table, and opened my laptop. I remember the meeting starting. I remember Richard standing at the front of the room with the Q3 slides, the ones I had prepared over the previous weekend, his name on the cover. I remember the light through the floor-to-ceiling windows, which always had a particular quality in October, gray and flat and somehow pressurizing, like weather that cannot decide what it wants to do. I remember the sound of the projector. I do not remember what came immediately before the moment I lost consciousness, which the neurologist later described as typical for that type of a rhythmic episode. The last thing I remember is sitting in my chair. The next thing I remember is the ceiling. But other people remember the part in between. Several of them told me about it carefully in the days that followed. Some sent messages. One wrote it down in a document and emailed it to me with the subject line in case it's useful. And what they described, consistently, was this. I slid sideways from my chair without making any particular sound, and the room took a moment to respond because the motion was so quiet that for a second or two people assumed I had dropped something. And then Richard, standing at the front with his clicker in his hand, looked down the length of the table to where I was and said, in a tone that was more irritated than alarmed, "This is what she does. She wants the attention." Someone called 999 anyway. Several people pushed back their chairs. A woman named Claudette, who worked in operations and sat 2 seats from me, and whom I had always been fond of without knowing her particularly well, crouched beside me and held my hand until the paramedics arrived. She told me later that she had spoken to me even though I couldn't hear her, which is the kind of detail that makes you feel held in a way you do not entirely know how to process. The paramedics put me on a portable cardiac monitor in the elevator on the way down. The reading they got was, apparently, concerning enough to warrant a blue light run to the hospital. I spent that night in cardiology. I spent 3 more days there while they adjusted my medication dosage, ran a battery of tests, and a consultant with a carefully neutral expression explained to me that the combination of overwork, missed doses, and physiological stress had destabilized my rhythm in a way that could, under a slightly different set of circumstances, have been significantly worse than it was. I said, "How much worse?" He said, "The kind of worse we don't like to think about." I lay in that hospital bed for a long time after he left. The ward was busy and there was always noise, machines, voices, the sound of the corridor. But inside I was very quiet. Quieter than I had been in years, actually. There is something about a hospital bed that strips a certain quality of pretense. You are in a gown. You are attached to things. Nobody is asking you to produce anything. And in that quiet, I thought about what the consultant had said, and I thought about Richard's voice in that conference room, and I thought about the Mental Health Awareness Week email, and I thought about 3 years of arriving first and leaving last and rescheduling my own medical care around client deadlines. And something in me that had been very tight for a very long time became, slowly, extremely still. I did not feel angry, exactly. Not yet. What I felt was something that I think the word asterisk clarity comes closest to describing. The kind that arrives when you stop explaining something away and simply look at it. I was in the hospital for 4 days. On the 5th day, I was discharged with new medication, an urgent follow-up appointment already scheduled, and strict written instructions about rest and reduced workload. On the 6th day, I received an email from Petra Sands, head of people operations at Caldwell and Voss, asking me to arrange a call at my earliest convenience to discuss next steps regarding your current absence and role responsibilities. I stared at that email for a long time. Current absence. As if I were somewhere I was not supposed to be. As if the hospital had been a choice I'd made without proper authorization. I called Claudette that evening instead of responding to Petra. We had exchanged numbers in the hospital. She had visited, which I had not expected, and brought a bag with things she had guessed I might need, which I had found quietly devastating in the best way. I asked her what the mood in the office was like. She was quiet for a moment before she answered. "Miriam," she said carefully, "there have been some conversations. I don't want to say too much over the phone, but I think you need to be careful." I asked her what she meant by careful. She said, "I think they were already looking for a reason, and I think they found one." I thanked her. I ended the call. And then I sat in my flat in Lewisham in the dark for a while, thinking about the word asterisk reason. Thinking about what it meant that they had been looking for one. Thinking about the fact that my director had stood in front of a room full of witnesses and called my cardiac episode a performance, and that the company's response to my hospitalization had been, apparently, to open a file rather than send flowers. Then I went to my desk. I opened my laptop. I opened the folder. I read through it for the first time with purpose rather than reflex, not scanning it as I occasionally did when something needed to be retrieved, but reading it from the beginning, chronologically, as a document that told a story. And what I found, laid out across 18 months of captured emails and meeting notes and Slack messages and calendar invitations with appended commentary I had written to myself in quiet moments, was not at all what I had been carrying in my head. In my head, what had happened at Caldwell and Voss was a complicated, gradual, somewhat ambiguous experience of a workplace that was imperfect and a manager who had disappointed me. The kind of thing you process with a therapist and eventually contextualize as a difficult chapter rather than a defining injustice. That is the story I had been telling myself because it was more manageable than the alternative. The folder told a different story. It told the story of a director who had systematically stripped attribution from his analysts' work over a period of 18 months. It told the story of a string of emails in which work I had explicitly authored was presented to senior leadership under Richard's name without correction. It told the story of a performance review, my annual review, which I had found competent but not effusive, in which Richard had described my contributions in language so generic and hedged that it bore almost no relationship to the specificity of what I had actually produced. It told the story of a pay conversation from 8 months ago in which I had raised, carefully, and with data, the question of whether my compensation reflected my adjusted responsibilities after the layoffs, and Richard had responded by saying the firm was in an asterisk period of recalibration, and that he would asterisk champion my case internally when the timing was right, and the timing had never, subsequently, been right. It told the story of meetings I had not been invited to, opportunities I had not been informed of, a promotion cycle that had passed over me despite my clearly documented output, a cycle I had only learned about secondhand, from someone in a different team, after the decisions had already been made. And then there were the messages, the informal ones. The Slack messages Richard sent at 9:45 on a Thursday evening asking for a revised model before EOD tomorrow, which technically meant he was giving me 14 hours, but in practice meant he was giving me the hours between 9:45 at night and the start of business the next morning, and he knew that, and I had always simply done it. There were the meeting follow-ups where I was copied on summaries of work I had done, described in language that attributed the thinking to the team rather than me. The team's analysis suggests, the team's recommendation is our team has developed, while the solo accomplishments in those same summaries were always attributed in the singular to Richard. I have recommended, I have proposed, I have built a framework. It was consistent. It was documented. It was, read with clear eyes, a pattern. I closed the laptop just after midnight. My hands were steady. My heart, the one I had been neglecting for 2 years, was, for the first time in a while, beating normally. I called my employment solicitor the next morning. I want to say something about this decision, because I think it is easy to describe what came next in a way that makes it sound impulsive or emotionally driven, and it was neither of those things. I had used a solicitor once before, years earlier, for a contract review at a previous job. Her name was Adiz. She was thorough and direct, and she had given me her card at the end of that meeting and said, "Keep this." The kind of person who reads a contract carefully enough to have questions is the kind of person who will eventually need it. I had kept the card. I had moved it from wallet to wallet across 6 years without quite knowing why. The way you keep certain things not because you anticipate needing them, but because something in you recognizes them as important. I called her at 9 in the morning. I told her briefly what had happened, the collapse, the hospitalization, the email from Petra, what Claudette had said about conversations in the office. She asked me 2 questions, whether I had any documentation and whether I had responded to Petra's email yet. I said yes to the first and no to the second. She said, "Good, don't respond yet, send me what you have." I spent 2 days compiling a clean version of the folder, organized chronologically, cross-referenced, with a summary document I had written in the same dispassionate register I used for financial reports, because that felt like the appropriate register for evidence. I sent it to Adiz on a Tuesday afternoon and did not hear back until Thursday morning, when she called me and said, in the very specific tone of a professional who has looked at something and formed an opinion she is choosing to deliver carefully, "Miriam, this is very thorough." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think we have more than one avenue here." We met in person the following week. She laid out what she saw with the kind of clarity I had spent 3 years craving in a professional context and never quite finding. There were grounds, she said, for an employment tribunal claim on the basis of race and sex discrimination in promotion decisions. The pattern of attributional erasure was particularly relevant there. There were grounds for a claim around reasonable adjustments and disability discrimination, given that my arrhythmia was, under the Equality Act, likely to qualify as a disability, and that the firm's consistent structuring of my workload in ways incompatible with its management had materially contributed to a medical crisis. There was the incident itself, Richard's statement in front of witnesses, which was documentable through 3 separate accounts and constituted, in her assessment, a textbook case of harassment related to disability. And there was the timing of Petra's email and the behavior of the HR file that Claudette had alluded to, which suggested that the firm may have begun constructing a case for dismissal while I was hospitalized, which would open a further avenue around unfair dismissal and victimization. She said all of this in a tone that was measured and professional, but when she looked up from her notes at the end, there was something in her expression that was not quite professional, something that was simply human, and she said, "I want you to understand what you were sitting on." I said I was beginning to. I also, at her advice, documented the conversation with Claudette more formally, a witness account, signed and dated, and reached out quietly to 2 other colleagues who had been in the room that Thursday morning. Both of them, when I explained what I was doing, agreed without hesitation to provide written statements about what they had heard Richard say. One of them told me that she had wanted to say something to me in the hospital, but hadn't known what was appropriate. The other said, "I have been waiting for someone to do something about him for a long time." That sentence stayed with me, because it pointed toward something I had been slow to understand about the nature of what Richard did, that it was not singular, not targeted only at me, not a discrete set of grievances that existed in isolation. The behavior was structural. I was not the first person to have carried his workload and watched him take credit for it. I was not the first person to have been quietly diminished while Richard's star rose. There were others. They were still there, sitting at their desks, and some of them were keeping records too. One of them, a man named James, who had been at the firm for 4 years and whose name I had seen appear in some of the emails I had saved, called me after my second colleague passed on my contact details. He was cautious on the phone. He asked, before he said anything substantive, whether I had a solicitor. I told him I did. He paused, and then he said, "Okay, then I have some things I would like to share with you." What James told me added a dimension to the picture I had not previously seen from my particular angle. He had been in Richard's orbit 2 years before I arrived. He had experienced the same recruitment pattern, the precise flattery, the feeling of being chosen, the careful early investment in visibility, and the same gradual shift once Richard had understood how useful he was and how unlikely he was to make a fuss. James had been passed over for promotion twice. He had not documented things as consistently as I had, but he had some emails, and more importantly, he had memory, specific, detailed, temporally anchored memory of conversations that established a pattern of behavior going back further than my own records reached. I listened to everything he told me. I thanked him. I introduced him to Adiz. Meanwhile, I had not yet responded to Petra's email. I had not returned to the office. I was officially on sick leave. My GP had provided a note covering the first 2 weeks following my discharge, and my cardiologist had subsequently extended this, citing the need for medication stabilization and monitored recovery. Every time Petra emailed, Adiz handled the response. Every time Richard sent a message, and he did send messages, 3 in the first 2 weeks, each more carefully worded than the last, the tone migrating from brisk to neutral to something that might, if you squinted, pass for solicitous. Adiz advised me to archive them without engaging. I want to describe what those weeks were like, because I think they are important. They were not triumphant weeks. They were not the weeks of a woman who had cracked the code and was watching the dominoes fall into place with satisfaction. They were strange and uncomfortable and occasionally frightening. I was still adjusting to my new medication. I was still processing, in the way that takes longer than the event itself. What it had meant to be lying on the floor of a conference room while my boss told a room full of people I had engineered it for effect. I had good days and less good days. I called my mother more than I had in years. I let myself, in the privacy of my flat in Lewisham, be less composed than I usually allowed. And I did something else, which I had not done for a very long time. I rested, not performatively, not as a tactic, but genuinely. I slept past 7. I ate meals at a table. I walked along the river on afternoons when the light was better than London usually promises and tried to remember what I was like before I had converted myself entirely into a professional instrument. It was harder to find that person than I expected. She had been there, I knew, curious, expansive, funny in a dry way that I liked about myself, interested in things that had nothing to do with models and forecasts. But 3 years of that office had put a very heavy layer over her, and digging back down was slow work. The formal complaint was filed 8 weeks after my collapse. It was comprehensive, detailed, and documented. It named Richard Hale and Petra Sands individually and named the firm institutionally. Adiz had prepared it with the care of someone who had done this before and understood that the most powerful document is the one that does not overreach. That says precisely what it can evidence and nothing beyond. It was, I remember thinking when I read the final draft, not angry in tone. It was simply true. And truth, presented without decoration, has a particular weight that anger sometimes obscures. The firm's response, through their external legal counsel, arrived 2 weeks later. It was defensive but not confident, the specific tenor of a legal letter written by people who have looked at what you've sent them and understood that they cannot simply dismiss it. They disputed certain characterizations. They offered procedural explanations for some of the documented events. They did not, I noticed, dispute the witness accounts of what Richard had said in the conference room. That omission was, Adiz said, instructive. Then something happened that I had not planned or engineered, and I want to be honest about that because I do not want to claim strategic genius for something that was, in part, simply the consequence of an environment that had been quietly unsustainable for longer than it had tolerated me. A woman in the London offices of Caldwell and Voss's parent firm, a firm 3 levels above the building in Canary Wharf, the firm that owned the firm that employed Richard, published a long internal post on the company's employee forum. It was about workplace culture. It was about the gap between the language of inclusion that appeared on every company website and the lived reality of what it felt like to work in a firm where credit was hoarded, where certain voices were systematically made smaller, where HR functioned as a protective mechanism for structure rather than for people. She did not name names. She did not have to. She described patterns that were, to anyone who had worked in that building, immediately recognizable. The post generated 217 internal responses within 48 hours. I know this because Claudette, who was still in the office and who had become something closer to a close friend in those weeks than I had previously allowed myself to have in a work context, sent me a screenshot with no accompanying text except 3 asterisks. I sat with that for a day before deciding what to do with it. Then I called Adiz. She said, "It changes the pressure. It doesn't change your case, but it changes the pressure." That was all I needed to know. The settlement negotiations began in month 4. I will not describe them in detail because they involved confidentiality provisions that I have agreed to respect, and because the specific numbers are not the point of the story. What I will tell you is this. The firm made an offer in the 3rd week of negotiation that Adiz assessed as low. They made a revised offer 2 weeks later that reflected a significant recalibration of their assessment of their own exposure. The final figure, which I accepted, at Adiz's advice, because it was fair and because a tribunal, however strong the case, is a long process that costs emotional energy you cannot always predict, was enough to do what I actually needed it to do. It was enough to give me a year to not have to make a decision under pressure. A year to rest properly, to finish treating my heart like something worth protecting, to rebuild in the direction I actually wanted to go rather than the direction I had been grinding toward out of habit, and the fear of giving people a reason to think they'd been right about me. Richard Hale was not fired in any official announcement I was made aware of. What I know, through Claudette, through James, through the particular silence that followed the firm's internal review, is that he was reassigned. Moved sideways, in the language of organizations that do not like to admit wrongdoing, but have nonetheless understood that a problem exists. His name disappeared from the managing director roster on the company website sometime in month 5. His LinkedIn was updated, quietly, to reflect a role at a smaller firm. I saw it once, by accident, while looking for something else. I did not feel satisfied in a loud way. I felt the specific, quiet satisfaction of seeing a number balance correctly after a long reconciliation. Petra Sands remained. I understand she is still there. Some mechanisms protect themselves very well. But I left, and leaving in this case was not a defeat. I want to say that clearly, because I know how easy it is to hear a story like mine and feel that the only satisfying ending is the one in which the woman stays and takes the corner office and wins the territory. That was not what I needed. What I needed was to stop spending my life producing for a structure that had spent 3 years erasing my name from it. What I needed was to be somewhere that I built for myself, with my name on it from the beginning. I started consulting independently, which I had always known was a theoretical option and had never quite been willing to risk. It was slower than I expected in some ways and faster in others. The first 2 clients came through people who had worked with me directly at Caldwell and Voss, people who knew whose thinking they had actually been relying on. And the referrals that followed from those relationships built something that was, within 18 months, more remunerative and more creatively satisfying than anything the previous 3 years had offered me. I kept my cardiology appointments, every 4 months without rescheduling. I take my medication in the morning with a glass of water, and I no longer pray that no one will notice because I no longer work somewhere that punishes you for having a body that occasionally requires attention. That sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. I spoke to Claudette last week. She is still at the firm, though she is considering leaving, has been considering it for a while, she says, with the particular energy of someone who is getting close to a decision. I told her that whenever she got there, I had a referral for her. She laughed. She said, "I always knew you were going to be fine." I said, "I wasn't always sure." She said, "I know, but I was." I think about that conversation sometimes when I am sitting at my desk now. in the spare room of my flat in Lewisham that I converted into an office. And I think about what it means to have been seen clearly by someone when you could not quite see yourself. I think about the specific gift of that in an environment designed to make you doubt your own perception. I also think, occasionally, about Richard standing at the front of that conference room with his clicker and his Q3 slides that I had built from scratch over a weekend, looking down the table at my body on the floor and saying what he said. I think about how confident he was, how certain that it would land the way he intended, as a dismissal, a diminishment, a public recategorization of a medical emergency as a character flaw. I think about how little he understood, in that moment, about the 18 months of documentation sitting on an encrypted drive in my flat, about the solicitor whose card I had kept for 6 years in my wallet, about Claudette's hand holding mine in the elevator, about the specific danger of underestimating someone whose greatest skill is not making noise. I don't think about him often, just sometimes, just enough to remember what I learned. The lesson, such as it is not particularly dramatic. It is this: institutions do not protect people. People protect people, Claudette did, and James did, and Adiz did. And the only real protection you ever have against the person in the room who controls the story is the capacity to produce evidence that the story was never what they said it was. For most of my professional life, I had thought of my habit of documentation as bureaucratic fastidiousness, a professional quirk, the residue of a training that valued audit trails and clear records. It turns out it was armor, different from the kind I had been building since I was a girl, but armor nonetheless. And when the moment came to need it, it held. They named it a performance issue. What it actually was a paper trail, and it had my name on every page. If this story stayed with you, if you recognized something in it, or someone you know lived something like it, let me know in the comments. I read them. And if you're new here, this is what we do on this channel. We tell the truth about what it costs to endure quietly and what it looks like when someone finally decides to stop.